Let's bring in our political editor, Andrew Clennell. And Andrew, the big development in that news conference was the fact that Greg Hunt confirmed there was going to be a review of all travel out of Europe. This follows the announcement by Donald Trump that they were going to ban travel out of Europe except for the UK, and the federal government saying that it wants its chief medical officers to undertake that as well. The other component of that news conference, which doesn't come as much of a surprise, we've been talking about it now for a number of days, and that is this mass gathering issue and the fact that there's a Grand Prix in Melbourne with a number of individuals from a team already confirmed or at least being tested for coronavirus.
Eight team members, Kieran, and you know, Cricket Australia has confirmed to us this afternoon that a spectator at the T20 World Cup final, I believe in the Women's World Cup final, I believe in the members area of the MCG, has also tested positive to coronavirus. So you see that situation with mass gatherings, that potential there. And you know, the decisions of the government over the next few days on this could become a big deal down the track. And we revealed last hour that the sporting codes have been regularly in contact with government, and the chief medical officers have been regularly discussing what should be done about mass gatherings. You saw the Victorian Health Minister there say, look, what we're looking at, not just sporting events. If this does happen, we're not ready yet, but it could happen. Things like weddings. I mean, talk about ways to shut down the economy, apart from the public health emergency side of things. On it, in terms of the travel ban, yes, I mean, often on foreign policy we seem to follow the US, including on this issue of coronavirus, or occasionally they even follow us, but we tend to do what they do. I think it's important to note in that American ban, as I understand it, on European travel, that American citizens can still come to the country, or residents. So it's similar to the travel bans we have on, including to China, where if you were, say, an Australian citizen in Europe and this does happen in the next day or two, you would be allowed to come into Australia, but if you were visiting, you wouldn't be allowed in at all. I mean, what would that mean for all sorts of sporting events or mass events? Obviously, the person to really raise this and push it outside of his own leader's direction on this morning was Bill Shorten. Let's have a listen to what he said.
The only way to make sure this pandemic is not worse than it otherwise could be is to have more drastic social distancing measures. Singapore and Japan and parts of China, they are putting in more draconian reactions. As a result, it would appear that some of their pandemic numbers are not going to be as bad as other countries who are just doing too little too late. This is going to be a major policy question, not in weeks and months, but in days. Do we keep having big events? Will we teach school from home? We've got to have more social distancing, and that is the only way to stop this pandemic being worse than it might otherwise be.
Andrew, the former Labor leader Bill Shorten will be joining us on this program in 1 hour from now as well. He feels very strongly about that particular issue, as you can see from his comments with Laura Jays earlier. Let's hear now the Prime Minister. Mr Morrison was asked about this issue, and then we'll come back to Andrew for a few more thoughts on that.
Well, it's very simple. You follow the health advice. I'm going to the footy this weekend. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm sure many Australians would, and I encourage you to, unless you're ill, and unless there's a reason. There have been no suggestions from those body of health advisors for that to occur at this point. Now, we can't know the future. And if at some point in the future the health advice were to change, then I'm sure they'd give that advice.
So the Prime Minister there saying that following the medical advice, but at the same time, and you can understand where Bill Shorten's coming from, you've got NBA suspended in the United States, you've got various worsening situations in countries like Italy and beyond those borders as well. And the question is, there's a bit of short-term pain, some sporting events being held in empty stadiums, but is that needed for the longer-term game to move before this starts spiralling?
I think you said last hour there seemed to be an air of inevitability about it, Kieran, and I kind of feel the same way. I mean, obviously the chief medical officers are waiting to see if the disease spreads, if there's more cases. It sounds like from what the Victorian Health Minister was saying there that a lot of it's overseas people there, but in New South Wales it's about 50-50 at the moment between local transmission and overseas cases, and that's why if there's someone who's going to push for some sort of a different situation with mass gatherings and sporting events. I think it could be the New South Wales Chief Medical Officer, Kerry Chant. Interesting there that Scott Morrison's basically saying, I'm waiting on the advice. And, of course, he had that advice in relation to the travel ban on China, and that's why he acted. But I wonder at what point he's going to say, well, hang the advice. I can see where this is going. Instead, it seems this is almost a daily discussion between the chief medical officers, the politicians and the sporting codes. An NRL source said to me today, we'll do whatever the government wants us to do. Now, obviously, it's not in their interest to declare it on their own because they'll lose 20 to 30% of revenue from gate receipts. But you get to the situation where you wonder, you've got the Cricket World Cup affected, the Grand Prix potentially affected. We've had a case in Canberra, someone attended a Universities Australia conference. So again, a mass gathering. It seems like these are the sort of places where we could see a wider outbreak of this disease.
And as I said, if there can be just a month or a few weeks of pain in terms of some of those restrictions to get a lid on this thing in this country, which we are lucky to be an island nation and the tyranny of distance might work in our favour. If there is a move like Bill Shorten is saying, we'll be talking to Bill Shorten in an hour from now. Let's look at the economic stimulus package today, and there's a big focus on households. There was we know for years, Andrew, that the government, the coalition's been critical of Labor's approach, but in terms of moving fast and focusing on households in terms of payments, there's a very similar profile in terms of this package.
Yeah, it's good news for small business, good news if you're a family under $100,000 a year, or if your pensioners are on New Start because they want the money out the door. They figure if they give these cheques like Kevin Rudd did to everyone, the money won't get out the door. Even their tax cut from a year ago, they feel a lot of people put that into their mortgages. Poor people, or poorer people less well off, are more likely to spend the money and get the economy going. If we can have a look at some of the measures, I think we might have a graphic here on it. It's $750 payments for certain households, I guess. 6.5 million Australians to benefit. 4.8 billion, that is. That's quite a lot of money. Ken Henry said to Kevin Rudd, go households, go early and go hard, and that's exactly what Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg have done. And that's the 31st of March. Everyone gets that on that date. Just so they can spend it in that next quarter to try and stop that June quarter being negative in terms of recession-wise. And then if we can have a look at perhaps some of the measures that are helping small businesses and apprentices, and increased instant asset write-off, so from $30,000 to $150,000. Apprentices' wages subsidised. Of course, we know pensioners were a good vote winner for Scott Morrison at the election, as were tradies. These are the sort of voters he has to attract. Not that I want to be cynical at all about it. He's clearly, New Start people are going to vote Labor, so it is really about getting the economy moving. But look at all those concessions for small business, about $8 billion in there, $17 billion in all, and $17.5 billion in all, and $1 billion of it is for tourism, although that seems like it might take a bit longer to get out there, because he said he'll have to consult with the states and all that. We're talking about waiving national park fees and all that sort of thing. So that'll take a bit more working out, which is a bit problematic, as we've seen with the bushfire recovery. But cash out the door 31st of March. They're hoping to see some real activity in April. Still some hope in the government this March quarter, January to the end of March, they can stave off that negative number. Two quarters of negative growth obviously is a recession, because the feedback from business they've had is that the coronavirus has only really hit at the end of the quarter. So I guess they're crossing their fingers on that one. Still, when he was talking to you, when you were asking him a question at the press conference there, Kieran, he certainly didn't rule out a recession. He certainly didn't want that grab we can play later where he says, there will be no recession under my watch, or we expect this to save us from recession. Let's have a look to the question and answer. Have a listen.
Will this package be enough to save the nation from recession?
We have worked carefully, Kieran, to make sure that we have got a proportionate response here to meet the challenge. Now, this is, as I said, 1.2% of GDP. To give you some comparison, when the initial stimulus was done for the GFC many years ago, those payments equated to some 0.88% of GDP. This is, I think, a key difference, is that we understand that for the Australian economy to continue to move forward, businesses need to continue to go forward and do what they do each day.
A big day for the government, a big day for the nation with that stimulus package, and the Prime Minister will be delivering the first address to the nation that we've seen from a Prime Minister since, I believe, Kevin Rudd during the GFC. That's tonight at 7 p.m.
Yeah, it's a big deal. We should all be watching that, see what he has to say, particularly about the health emergency. One interesting aspect to this announcement today is how it wipes the surpluses, it seems, Kieran. If we can have a look at that. Mid-year economic forecast, they said a $5 billion surplus 2019-20, that's gone. 31st of March, $4.8 billion out the door for a start. 2020-21, $6.1 billion. If they're fair income in the budget, they're going to say that's gone. 2021-22, $8.4 billion. You've got a chance because there's only a tiny bit of spending in that year. But 2022-23, $4 billion. That was thin to start with. So the old back in black thing's wearing thin, but the Prime Minister made a point of saying, put your hand up if you knew this coronavirus was coming. They've gone big. They've gone reasonably big because they're hoping not to do it in the budget, obviously, but they might have to, especially if we look to more drastic measures like public gatherings being banned, etc., which may or may not happen. It would happen, I think, if the virus spread, and unfortunately it looks like it's spreading, but probably a few weeks off from that. So there is a possibility of more measures in the budget. I guess one of those measures could be giving money to businesses for sick leave, for casual workers, or sick leave generally, isolation leave, that sort of thing. I don't think that's off the table at all, Kieran, from the discussions I've had. But they just decided not to do it this time. They went with the welfare sickness payments at the moment. Yeah. But if it continued and got a lot worse, that's something they could do. The British government certainly did that. So nothing's still off the table. There are still things that are going to be worked on. We could see a second round of stimulus come the May budget.
We could indeed, Andrew, and that's if we're going to be in Parliament, or maybe they might have shut it down by then. The lock-up might be seen as one of those mass gatherings they need to move on. Thanks, Andrew Clennell. We'll talk to you at the top of the hour.